Cool. Then let's start. Right. Hello everyone who has joined us today for April's Wednesday webinar. I am Akshata from Srijan. Today's webinar is Aligning Team Mindset with Organizational Values with Srinidhi from Srijan. Post today's session, we are confident that you would have strengthened your ideas on how you can map organizational values while delivering important projects. Some prerequisites before the webinar starts. If you have any audio issues, please send them on Q&A and I'll assist you there. If you have any questions for the presenter, please submit them on Q&A as well and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Slides of the webinar will also be available on srijan.net and will be shared with you via email in a couple of days. That's it. We have got lots to cover today, so let's get right into it. Sri, over to you.
Thanks, Akshita. Hello all. So let's just get started. So today's presentation, we're going to try and cover how we align team mindset with organization values. To do this, we'll follow the following agenda, which is try and cover what's culture and what is organizational culture. How do you evolve organizational culture? And then how do you ensure that employees sort of learn it and imbibe it into the DNA of the organization? Then we slowly pivot towards what's the organizational values at Srijan. We look at how we inside Srijan align towards this, and then we move on to Q&A. So culture in Wikipedia is defined as characteristics of a group of people defined by everything from language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, arts, etc. So we know that different countries or parts of the country as well got different cultures that's evolved over time. This does not happen like a drop in the bucket. This happens over a long period of time when people evolve and they adapt and generations together follow this. When it comes to an organizational culture, it is no different. This is still a set of values, norms, and beliefs that is shared by the members of the organization. And it is a totality of the customs which is shared by all the members in the organization. As a culture in a regular society evolves, the organizational culture also evolves over time. So how does the organizational culture itself evolve over time? So there are founders to any organization. Otherwise, the philosophy of the founders are then sort of selected into a criteria. And I say selected into a criteria, the roots of the culture, which comes in from the founder, are then turned into employee culture when similar mindset people are hired and they are starting to form an organization. Once this happens, the top management or the actions of the top management determines what is correct and acceptable behavior in the organization. So you see a small loop here, which means this evolves over time. And then there is socialization of this culture, which is imbibing the culture into all the people in the organization, either by processes or by new employees coming in, or by making sure that everyone's made sure that they are aware of the culture and they imbibe that into their daily activities in the organization. That ultimately leads to the culture of the organization over time. How do we make sure that the employees learn about this culture and then sort of turn it into a culture that is constantly understood and adhered to? First off, there's the mission statement. This is making sure that the mission statement is very clear to everybody in the organization. Then we follow it up with stories. When I say stories, it's usually narratives about the organization's founder. How did this come through? What was the rule breaking that they did? What was the rule formation that they did? What was the history of the company? How long did it take? Were there times when the company people were doing night outs, working 24 hours a day? There are sometimes they were relaxing, going on trips. All these are shared as stories with the rest of the organization to make sure that they are felt welcome and a part of the organization. Then there are rituals, which otherwise are repetitive sequence of activities which reinforce these values into everybody in the organization. The material symbols is usually a combination of the types of office, furnishings, what we do, how we live, how we work, which reinforces to everybody in the organization to say these material symbols are also reaffirming our faith in the cultures and values that is being followed. Language is quite self-explanatory. It is usually the unique terms or the unique sort of words that is being used inside the organization so that the vocabulary is consistent and everybody understands each other. Now, with this, I'll slightly pivot towards the Agile Manifesto, getting back to sort of the topic of the day. The Agile Manifesto talks about individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to changes over following plans. So, as we know, this is a recap signed by about 17 people when they met up and they said, hey, let's do this. And henceforth, there were a lot of signatories into this manifesto. And as we all agree, the Agile Manifesto is well accepted in the society today and pretty much the execution strategy for many organizations and projects in today's world. A unique thing about this is also that while the things on the right hand side are valued, it's more the things on the left hand side that takes a priority. Right? Now let's quickly look at what is the organization values at Srijan and how this maps back to the values or the Agile Manifesto itself. The organization values at Srijan is to be authentic, be responsible, be vulnerable, be long term, and be a group. So I'll take a couple of minutes going through each of these. I'd really welcome any questions you have until now or post this slide as well, so that we can have a little bit of a Q&A before we move on to the next slide. What do we mean by being authentic? All these values are measured at different levels, either at an individual level or at a team level or at an organization level or even at a customer level. When we say customer level, what does the customer perceive us as? And these customers could be people buying products from us or people buying services from us. Being authentic means we need to be authentic to ourselves as an individual and say, hey, where am I in my growth path and my journey and what can I improve on? In a team, we need to be authentic to the team and as a part of the team to say, hey, what did we do very well as a team, or as a team, where do we have improvements to work on? From a customer's perspective, the customer will also perceive us to say, are we purely talking or are we showing any actions around it? In other words, actions do speak louder than words, and hence being authentic is very much important even from how the customer perceives us. Being responsible, as an individual we should take responsibility for what we write. We of course produce software. There are organizations producing different products, but any product we produce, we are responsible for them, and we need to make sure that the customers feel it. We need to make sure that the team feels it. Say, hey, we are proud that we produce something that is being used in the real world to solve a real time. We need to be vulnerable as well. We can't shy away from this. Being vulnerable is not a bad thing. It is, we're all human. It is an acceptance of the fact that we're all human. And from time to time, there are places where we could do a mistake. We need to accept it, either at an individual or at a team level, and acknowledge it. And also, more importantly, put in a plan to say, how will I make sure I do not do this again? Or I will make sure that somebody else does not do this again. That's where the team comes into picture to say, hey, I did something, but guys, this is a way where others could avoid a similar mistake. It's quite important for customers to know about this as well many a times, because this improves relationships. Rather than trying to cover things under the carpet, it's always encouraged to say, hey, if it's a mistake we've done, let's own it up, but let's also gain the confidence of the customer by saying, here is what we're doing to make sure that this does not repeat again, or there is a plan of action even before the customer asks for it. All this leads into a long-term strategy as well at an individual team and customer level, wherein we start thinking about how will this impact me 6 months down the lane, 1 year down the lane, or 5 years down the lane of all the decisions that is being made right now. And thinking long term makes sometimes a thought process of, is this quite immediate as a action that I'm looking for, or will this actually help me, will this be more detrimental to me when I look at it in a long term thinking. And we at Srijan encourage, always think long term, do not think in a short term thought process at all, because that really helps us build ourselves better, both at individual level, a team level, and of course, our customers also get delighted and welcome repeat business from us. Being a guru means being able to help out other team members, help out the customers. This does not mean we simply start broadcasting our abilities of able to coach, able to think through. A guru otherwise is also a mentor, is a very good listener, is a very good orator, and is also somebody who can help sit through and solve problems. We encourage this culture at every level, and we also want to make sure that everybody imbibes it into their daily values. I'll take a pause here for 30 seconds. Any questions so far? Akshita, I'm guessing you're moderating.
So, Sri, we do not have any questions yet, but yes, you can continue this, and I'll let you know when the questions come.
Fair. Okay. So next on, let's look at how this maps back into the Agile Manifesto. Right? So individuals and interactions over processes and tools. The way we map this back to Srijan's values is by saying we will be authentic, we will be responsible, and we will be vulnerable, which will make sure that individuals and interactions start gaining a lot more importance rather than asking for processes or tools to be put in place always. Excuse me. So if you're authentic and you're having great interactions with different individuals or different touch points inside the team or with customer team members, then you're collaborating really well. What this allows you to do is not fall back onto processes or defined tool sets, but rather be able to message somebody or pick up a phone and say, hey, I need help. In other words, it relates back to being vulnerable as well, to say, I need help. You're taking a lot of responsibility by saying, if some work is picked up by us, it will be delivered on time, on quality, on date. That makes sure that nobody else has to come in and then put a process or a tool to track this further. I'd like to share a small story here at this point. Um, if you watch doctors as to what they do before getting into surgeries, they get in, they've got this wonderful practice of washing their hands. The way they wash their hands is they sort of rub their hands about 6 to 10 times. Then they sort of rub the backside of their palms, and then between the fingers, and then between the nails, the thumbs. They try and wash this until their elbow, right? And then, of course, they don't touch anything, and they immediately wear a glove before they go into a surgery. Now, this is not a written rule anywhere. This is something that is being practiced by every doctor, every surgeon across the world as an unwritten rule. The reason they do it is because they care for every patient getting into that operation theater. Now, the process or the tool does not exist here, but there is a individual or an interaction that is happening without having the need for somebody else to come in and enforce that to say, did you wash your hand 20 times before you got in? This sort of a thing is what we are trying to encourage as well, to say, please define this yourselves at an appropriate level rather than requesting somebody else to come in and put a framework around it. Because if somebody else comes in and puts this framework, they might not be people who understand the details of this entirely. Next thing is working software over comprehensive documentation. I think the best example for this is sort of the telephones in everyone's hand these days. I don't believe anybody has read through a comprehensive documentation of how to use either an iOS application or an iOS phone or an Android phone. People just open the phone, switch it on, and it's ready to go. People know immediately how to interact with it or what to do with it. This is a classic example of working software over anybody sitting and reading through a massive document. The way you do it is by being responsible for the software that you develop. Think about it long term rather than thinking about it as, hey, I have written a small document, somebody needs to read through it before they understand what I write. Because from a long term perspective, irrespective of how many updates you push, people will be able to immediately adapt towards it. Always be a guru. Think about how this is, how you can better it, how you can request other people to help you also better it, rather than trying to be the only person who can do it, right? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Again, customers are very, very important. uh, they pay our uh, salaries end of the month, always. Whether you work in a service based industry or a product based industry, it is ultimately the customer who's paying for everything. Instead of negotiating over contracts with the customers, take in all the values that we talk about in Srijan: be authentic, be responsible, vulnerable, long term, and guru, to try and see how you can collaborate better with the customer. If it means in a few odd places, you be sort of thinking from a vulnerability perspective, going back to the customer and saying, hey, you know what, we let a bug slip through. We figured out that we have let this slip through even before you realized it, dear customer, and we have already developed a patch for it, and it will be released in a day. This helps reinforce the relationship with the customer, rather than the customer coming back and then saying, hey, you let X number of bugs slip through. So next time, to avoid this, let's try and see how I can put a contract around it. Say, what is the acceptable amount of bugs, or what is the acceptable amount of SLA that needs to be thought through for this kind of thing. So sometimes being vulnerable is a very, very good thing. Of course, always be a guru. When we say a guru, think from a customer's perspective in the vertical the customer is working in. Say what will improve their business, rather than thinking about what will improve your business with the customer. Because if the customer's business grows, it is only imperative that your business with the customer will also grow with it. Responding to change over following a plan. This is a wonderful value about following Agile, which is being really flexible, being able to respond to new changes that might come in, rather than following a waterfallish approach of sticking with a plan that was defined a year behind. And then, sort of, when you hit the target, you realize you're halfway there and you need another 50% distance covered at a later point. So market today changes very, very quickly. Be responsible for it. Think about the authenticity in what you're doing, and respond to these changes immediately, rather than sticking to sort of original plans defined. This allows the customer, or this gives the flexibility to the customers to say, hey, they can get the latest and greatest things with minimal amount of time delays from an organization, which reinforces their ability to think. They want to build further relationships with uh, your organization as well. This is what we follow inside Srijan. Um, okay, just before I move on again, Akshita, quick check. Any other questions?
Hi, Shri. So I have received one question. If you like, do you want to take it up now, or do you want to take it up in the later half of the webinar where we just talk about the questions?
We can take it up now.
Right. So this question, the first question is, how do you get consensus on organizational values? So is it common to all prescribed value set, or does it differ from one business to all?
So let me quickly jump back to some of these slides. So, how do you get a consensus across values? That's a great question. So, how does organization culture or values again evolve over time? It starts off with what the philosophy of the founder was. So, there are organizations like Apple, there are organizations like Tata, there are organizations similar to Srijan. Each of them starts off with what was the values with which the founder started this organization. Apple was started to say, hey, I want to do something really beautiful. Steve Jobs went and took classes in calligraphy rather than sort of going through course in computer science. And that sort of art came into Apple as an organization, which is followed even today. That value of my device or my product needs to not be geeky but look beautiful is followed on as a value. At Srijan, we follow a bunch of values that I just showed. These came in from our founders as well. These values are then selected. When I say selected, organization is not formed by one person, it's not just by the founder. So once the organization starts to grow, the founder starts hiring people with similar mindsets, right? These similar mindset people over time start discussing and determining, hey, these are the sort of values we want to grow our organization in. And when the organization grows further as well, they hire similar minded people into the top positions. And these top position people then trickle down the same value system into new hire in the organization. This need not be just at the top position, but through the organization, it's the same thing that is trickled down, which otherwise is called socialization. I'll go into socialization itself as a slide later, uh, with just sort of putting it out there. And this finally evolves into the organization culture over time. I hope that answers the question. If not, I'm happy to revisit the question again. Any other questions, Akshita?
Yes, there is one more question that has come up. So the person, hello.
Hey, Akshita, sorry,
Yeah, I'm
got
sorry.
cut off.
Yeah. So the question is, sometimes when we start working with the new clients, there are some conflicts with the organizational values and client values. How we should deal or resolve these conflicts?
That's a brilliant question. So it's not always necessary that the values followed by the organization align with the organization of the customer or the client. Now, of course, clients pay our salaries, but it does not mean we will bend over backwards to an extent of giving up our culture entirely. We will try and align to the culture of, or we should try and align to the culture of the client. We should communicate this to the client as well in a very well sort of presented format to say, hey, these are our cultures, these are our values. We follow them deep enough in the organization, which many times the customer sort of relates back to and appreciates that uh, these are sort of the values that they can expect from us as a vendor. If they don't align over a period of time, that sort of it will break away. But you'd rather want to break it at the beginning than sort of understand that there's a massive realignment in values and keep dragging it. I would compare it back to having met a new person and trying to make a friendship with them, right? If your sort of values don't align with your friend, you will not continue to call them a friend, and you will sort of leave them at a place of an acquaintance. That is what will happen in organizations if values do not match up. Okay, I will move on, Akshita. If there's other questions, I'm happy to pick them up after the next slide.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how did it happen at Srijan? Now, just after this, right, the alignment itself. Now we are slightly moving into the socialization phase of it. So at Srijan, what did we do? We had a lot of our leaders, you can see a lot of our leaders in the slide, who got into a room, brainstormed it out, and said, hey, we all, when we started following a bunch of these values without actually writing them down. Let's take some time out and sit down and write down what are the values that we do follow in the organization, and what are the ones we want to make sure it's broadcasted out there and is also imbibed into all the new people that we are bringing on board. It was a wonderful sort of a session. It took about 2 to 3 days of brainstorming. It's not a simple task. It's not a 2 hour meeting. It takes about 2 3 days for an organization to actually come back and say, what do we value and how do we want to take this further? Post that, it was broadcasted to a bigger set of people to say, hey, here is all the things we brainstormed on, we agreed on, but we will also involve a wider set of people to understand if they align with these values, or if we want to retweak some of these values. So there was a lot of exercises around here, trying to map back again all the 5 values over each individual here, over the team that they work with, and over the customers that each of these people here work with. So mapping this made sure that there was a wonderful activity around thinking through the values, understanding the values, and imbibing the values. When I say this was done, this falls back into a ritual and also a story around how these values came about. Once these rituals or once these repetitive activities were done, these individuals were given the baton or the responsibility to go back to the wider teams than the ones sitting here and talk with their respective individual teams and make sure that the value is understood by everyone in the organization, from an intern to the CEO. Everybody is adhering to similar values. This, of course, also happens with repetitive rituals at each team level now, and a lot of symbols in each team's way of working, and sitting back and asking in each retrospective about how did we align ourselves to the customer on a given value within the sprint. It might be an overhead to do all the values in every sprint, but try doing it at, I don't know, one value every sprint, and each team member starts thinking about what could they do, for example, about being authentic or about being a guru to the customer or getting better at it in the following sprint. This is how we are reinforcing it in Srijan, and this is a great way of aligning the whole organization towards the values rather than each person thinking through in a different way. Any questions until here?
No, none. None.
None? Okay. So at Srijan, we started defining and agreeing these values at a leadership level, like I showed you. And then the wider leadership gets on the same page, and we imbibe these values into the DNA of the organization. Now, there is also a reinforcement of these values by demonstrating them in action, which is more important than sort of broadcasting them or having PPT where around all these things. It is about demonstrating or coming back with examples of when did a customer come back and say, hey, I really liked it that you were authentic, or you were a guru, you took a step that you went through and told us, if you do this, it'll help you 2 years down the lane, rather than thinking through only for the next 15 days or the next quarter. You're helping us really think through these kind of reinforcements from either the customer or the team member will make sure that the team members also start looking into it as, hey, this is values in action and not simply something on pen and paper. With that, I finish this sort of presentation, and I'm happy to take a lot more questions.
Wow, that was a great session, Trey. Thanks for that super informative session. So, moving on, I have a couple more questions. So this one question is related to the point where you said customers are important since they pay our salaries. So when customer centricity is at the core of the client first policy, how can you say no for something to the client to be part of the long term strategy?
Great question. Great question. So it's not the center of the strategy. If you see on any of these, we're not saying customer is at the center of it, but rather saying customer pays our salary. We acknowledge it. However, we want them to be aligned to our values, right? So we can't simply uh, say we'll do anything and everything for the customer, but rather we will try and see uh, how much we can flex or how much we can align towards each other's thought process rather than simply going on about, hey, my culture is different, your culture is different. Because if you think about it, everything that happens in the world as a conflict today is a difference in opinion. And if those opinions do not coincide, then sort of there will always be friction. Let's not move towards that, but let's try and rather discuss what's the positive values we have and try and see if our customers also align towards it, or we also align towards what the customer is wanting.
Right. I hope it answers your question. The fourth question, the next question is when working on a project, what is more important, building alignment in your company or measuring the efforts with the decided KPIs?
Sorry, Akshita, could you kindly repeat that?
Yeah, sure. So this last question is when the teams are working on a project, what is more important, building alignment within the teams or measuring the efforts with decided KPIs?
Hey, that's a wonderful question. So Agile does not prescribe individual KPIs in any way. However, these KPIs or the key performance indicators are a way of setting a target for each individual or each team to achieve a certain amount of thing or to define a growth path for different people versus different teams. Right now, KPIs themselves help individuals grow. These have to be thought through as beyond the project or beyond the work that is being done as well. Within the project itself, yes, the project takes a priority. Yes, the items in the project will enable a piece of code or a product to hit the market, make revenue to our customers, and hence make revenue to us as well. But if you think about it, these can also be aligned towards the KPIs by saying, I will get better at, uh, let's say, just as an example, I will get better at writing code with very minimal defects. If this is sort of the KPI that's picked up by an individual inside the team, it helps that team member grow. And it also helps the customer grow by saying they receive quality code that has very minimal defects.
Right. So moving on to the next question, which would be the last question of our session. So this question, the person is asking, is there ever a conflict between thinking revenue and thinking organizational values, or is there a perceived conflict?
Is there a perceived conflict between organizational revenue and values? Is that a fair interpretation? Is the question?
Yes.
Okay. Um, there shouldn't be. There shouldn't be any conflict between revenue and values. So I'll give you an example again from Apple, and then we can try and see if that answers the question. Uh, for a very long period in time, Apple did not produce great products. After, in fact, the Macintosh came out initially, there was a dull period where Apple did not produce any wow factor product until the iPod was released. Why did this happen? This happened because they sort of lost their values and they started thinking purely on revenue. There was a CEO who came in from Coca-Cola and started driving revenues to be the factor of how the company would operate rather than values as the way to how company would operate. And this came down towards the revenue ultimately by driving down the revenue than taking the revenue up. It had to actually, there was a need to actually have Steve Jobs back in that position and come back and say, guys, you've forgotten the values of how this organization was founded. You got to simplify things. You got to make sure that customers' problems are solved. Those are the values at Apple. So let's go back towards it. And that's how sort of iPod came out of all this research. And when iPod came out, we all know how it took the market by storm, right? So compromising on values by thinking about revenue means you're not thinking about a long-term strategy, but rather you're being very, very tactical in thinking very, very short term. And that's detrimental to an organization over time. Okay? I hope that answers the question.
Sure. So I know I said the last question was the last question of the session, but there's another question that has come up, and I'm sure, Sri, that you would love to answer this. This question says,
Absolutely. We've got another 24 minutes, so I'm all happy to take questions or discussion.
right. So this question is about how Srijan handles things. The question goes, in your last slide, you showed how the new strategy is implementing in Srijan. And according to you, this is the great way of implementing new strategy. How do you deal with the lower level hierarchy disagreement, if there is any?
Um, the way any organization comes into picture is there is a hierarchy where not everybody aligns to every value possible. However, if you want to sort of grow the culture in the organization, over time, people realize the need for this value and they adapt towards it. Similar to what I was talking about the customer, it's very similar to employees as well. If we see that employees are uh, not aligning towards, let's say, being vulnerable, if they shy away from being vulnerable and saying, hey, I did something as a mistake, it's not their mistake. It's because they have not understood these values to begin with. And the only way it can be demonstrated to them is by being vulnerable back in front of them or being responsible towards the tasks that the people working with them are doing, right? So this does not happen sort of post a session with a bunch of people, or it will not happen during an onboarding phase of a new employee. But this will come into action post a couple of months of that employee working with other team members. Hence, the term that's used is actually called socialization. Right? Socialization itself means it needs to be a social culture, um, and in other words, the new employee, whether they are at the hierarchical structure of the top of the pyramid or the bottom of the pyramid, they see how this is working and they welcome this with open arms, to say, okay, if somebody is being vulnerable in front of me, I can equally go back and be vulnerable in front of them. This opens up the agile culture as well inside Srijan massively, wherein everything that is being done in the organization is taken both top down and bottom up by saying anybody in the organization can go back and question why a certain decision is being made and how does it impact either them individually or the team or the whole organization. I hope that answers the question.
Right. We hope that too. And with this, we are done with the questions. Uh, now that we have run towards the end of the webinar, if there are any more questions from your end, I would request all of you to write them to webinars@srijan.net. Thank you once again, Srinidhi, for leading such a delightful session. We are sure our attendees will find the tips helpful in building and maintaining a strong culture in their organizations. Also, a big thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. You all have been a great audience. You will be receiving today's presentation and session recording in your mailbox soon. As for our next webinar, you will be getting a mail from us, so stay tuned. That's all for today. Thank you for joining.
Thank you all. Thank you, Akshita, for arranging this so beautifully. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Shri.